Here's PragerU to try to convince you that you should tell your kids that there might be a God, even if you know that isn't true.
As a therapist, I'm often asked why depression and anxiety are so common among children and adolescents. One explanation, almost surely the most neglected, is declining interest in God and religion.
I'm skeptical of this, but let's say it's true. Should we therefore encourage belief in something we don't think is actually real? If we could show an increase in depression among kids is caused by declining belief in Santa Claus, should we try to prevent that by teaching kids in school that Santa Claus is real, even if we know that isn't the case? I'm not sure that would even be very effective. If people discover that they grew up being lied to just to make them feel better, that's going to cause a major erosion of trust. I doubt that would be good for society's overall well-being.
I see the consequences of this in my practice almost every day.
Your psychoanalysis practice? I think it's worth pointing out that psychoanalysis is not comparable to psychology or psychiatry. Studying something as complex as the human mind is difficult to do scientifically, but psychology and psychiatry do their best to apply the scientific method. Psychoanalysis, not so much. They seem less concerned about things like testability and falsifiability. To the degree that Ms. Commissar is employing the epistemic approach of psychoanalysis to this issue, her conclusions ought to be taken with a pretty big grain of salt.
And this is not merely my personal observation. A 2018 Harvard study involving 5,000 people examined how being raised in a family with religious beliefs affects the mental health of children. The study found that kids who attended a religious service at least once per week scored higher on psychological well-being measurements and had lower risks of mental illness.
Well, what's the mechanism exactly? Let's say that attending a religious service regularly has a causal effect on psychological well-being. Is that because God is rewarding them for going to church? Is it because folks who attend these services are more likely to believe in God and the idea of God's existence is a comfort to them? Or could it be that simply engaging with one's community has positive mental health benefits, regardless of whether that engagement is religious? If you type social isolation and health into Google Scholar, you'll find no shortage of papers showing that a lack of engagement with other people is very bad for both your mental and physical health. Being raised in a family that engages with one's community could be good for you, regardless of whether that engagement is religious in nature or not.
Weekly attendance was also associated with higher rates of volunteerism, lower probabilities of both drug use and early sexual initiation, and a sense of purpose.
Again, I see no reason to believe that engaging with the folks in your community on a regular basis can't have those same effects, even if such engagement is non-religious.
Yet despite all the evidence that religious involvement leads to positive behaviors, Gallup reports that the U.S. has seen a 20% decrease in attendance at formal religious services in the past 20 years.
That's not just true of formal religious services. People meeting up in person with other people in both religious and non-religious contexts has been declining for much more than just the past 20 years. A pretty important book in the social sciences is Bowling Alone by Robert Putnam. It was published in 2000 and discusses how membership in the kind of social organizations that require you to meet with other folks in person has been declining since about the middle of the 20th century. He uses bowling as an example because while the number of people who bowl has increased, the number of people who are members of bowling leagues has decreased. Putnam also argues that there are many negative consequences of this, including negative health consequences. Declining social engagement is not just a religious phenomenon.
In 2018, the American Family Survey revealed that nearly half of adults under 30 do not identify with any religion. From a purely psychological point of view, this is not a good trend. Nihilism, the belief in nothing, is a rich fertilizer for anxiety and depression.
First of all, citation needed. Secondly, this implies that the only alternative to religion is nihilism. There are plenty of things you can believe in that are not God.
In contrast, the belief in God, a guardian figure who loves us, is an invaluable source of support and comfort.
Well, not for the folks who are constantly told that they'll burn in hell because they happen to be gay or trans.
I am often asked by parents, how do I talk to my child about death if I don't believe in God or heaven? My answer is always the same. Fake it.
So lie then?
There are many things you don't tell your children the full truth about.
Well, there's not telling your children the full truth, and then there's telling them things you know aren't true. These are not the same thing.
For instance, if your children hear about a tragedy that has occurred in your community, you tell them that it will never happen to them.
Why would you tell them that? That seems to me like it would make them complacent and less likely to take steps to prevent it from happening to them and consequently increase the likelihood that it will.
We don't have a crystal ball and cannot know that bad things will not happen to our children. Yet we reassure them with a hopeful narrative. The same applies to believing in God and heaven. Even if you believe that when your life ends, your bones turn to dust and you are gone for eternity, such beliefs don't help children. They only scare them and create anxiety over death and dying.
I don't even think that's true. If all that happens when you die is that you lose consciousness, that's far less scary than maybe you'll go to an awesome place or maybe you'll go to a horrifying place. If hell is as bad as Christians say it is, then the prospect of permanent unconsciousness seems far more comforting to me than even a 1 in a million chance of hell.
Belief in a benevolent God and a heaven does help children with their fear.
Citation needed. Also, what do you suppose a belief in hell does?
In our current age of broken families, distracted parents, school violence, and nightmarish global warming predictions, imagination plays a big part in children's ability to cope.
Thank you for admitting that the prospect of heaven is basically Christian cope.
It is far better for kids to use their imagination constructing something positive, such as a God who cares about us, than the dark nihilistic idea that there's no creator and protector, and no purpose to our existence.
Well, that would depend on what the purpose is. If the purpose is to glorify him lest we suffer eternal torment, which is what Abrahamic apologists often tell me, that's not very comforting.
I am also frequently asked how parents can instill gratitude and empathy in their children. Again, the best answer is involvement in an organized religion.
Citation needed. If that religion teaches the inferiority or wickedness of outsiders and non-believers, as so many do, I have my doubts that this is the case.
All traditional faiths encourage gratitude and empathy as antidotes to entitlement and selfishness. These are the building blocks of strong character. They also protect against depression and anxiety. Additionally, religion provides children a chance for community. Being with people who share their faith can act as a buffer against the emptiness and isolation of modern culture.
But again, what reason do we have to believe that this isn't true of any kind of community engagement? There's no reason to believe that healthy community involvement has to be religious to be beneficial.
This is more necessary than ever in a world where teens can have hundreds of virtual friends and few real ones. And religion helps teach children mindfulness, a sense of self-control and discipline. Your young children might not be aware they are entering a house of worship, but they do know they're supposed to act in an appropriate manner when they are there. They have to relax their bodies and calm their minds.
Well, that depends on how fire and brimstone the sermon's going to be that day, doesn't it?
It is true that if you feel ambivalent about God and religion, your children will likely follow your example. However, if you practice religion or send your children to religious school, knowing it is good for them, you might surprise yourself and get something meaningful out of it too. In other words, your children may bring you back to faith.
Oh golly, you mean if I send my kids to learn things that I believe to be nonsensical, I could end up believing those nonsensical things too? Now there's a win-win scenario if I ever heard one.
It's certainly worth an extended experiment for their sake and for yours. Consider one more argument. If you take the idea seriously that your children should be free to choose or reject God and religion, they need to be exposed to God and religion.
Do you need to send them to a religious school to merely expose them to religion? And if my aim were to expose them to religion, I wouldn't just expose them to one religion. I wouldn't just expose them to Abrahamic religions.
How else will they be able to make a free and informed choice?
You say that as though you actually value your kids making free and informed choices. You're not advocating that religious folks expose their kids to atheism or to other religions. You're only asking atheists to be open-minded. This seems like a manipulation tactic to me. You know that many atheists say they value open-mindedness, so you are trying to appeal to that open-mindedness despite the fact that, I strongly suspect, open-mindedness is not something you really value yourself.
We live in a competitive, stressful society that idealizes materialism, selfishness, and virtual rather than real human connection. Having a religious community and a belief in God is the best antidote to all of that.
Citation needed. Why would secular community involvement be incapable of having the same effect?
Whether children choose to continue to practice as adults is something you cannot control, but at least give them a chance to believe in God and find comfort in religion. They deserve it.
They don't deserve to be lied to. If I had a child who felt drawn to religion, I wouldn't get in their way. If they wanted me to take them to church, I'd take them to church. But if I think their religion is nonsense, I'm not going to lie to them and say that I think, well, maybe it's true. I see no reason to believe that doing so is good for your relationship with your kids, especially in the long run. To everyone who helps me out on Patreon, you're a big help. Thanks so much.